When is a bomb not enough? When your enemy will stop at nothing to win, how can you succeed in that situation? Well, the bright engineers of the US military-industrial complex decided the best course of action would be to build an excessively large bomb. Devastation showered down from the skies above Hiroshima and Nagasaki on those scorching days in early August 1945. With that devastation came not only a catalyst to end the campaign between the Allied and Axis forces of World War II, but also the death and unbiased slaughter of innocent people. While it is difficult to determine just how many people died as a result of the two bombings, the Manhattan Engineer District estimates that there were 135,000 casualties in Hiroshima alone. After the first bomb exploded over the city of Hiroshima, in his statement on August 6, 1945, US President Harry Truman pronounced that it was like a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Hopefully, a rain that the earth will never see again. The ability to level a battlefield as quickly and brutally as the United States did was a feat of unimaginable consequences. While this weapon may have crippled Imperial Japan and aided in their ultimate surrender, the technology's mere introduction to the global stage was an extremely precarious decision from the United States. The realization that the United States had the capability to decimate an enemy that was considered to be an unrelenting, overwhelming force struck fear into the hearts of many across the world. Knowing the fear and ambition of her peers, the United States began a mission to develop an even larger, stronger, more ominous cousin to Fat Man and Little Boy, the hydrogen bomb. Unfortunately, the pendulum of military superiority often sways on the backs of those thought as collateral damage. This time, it was the Marshall Islands. Ironically, the Marshall Islands were born of fire, rising out of the northern Pacific Ocean from volcanic eruptions over the course of millions of years. Small islets formed from the flames to shield the blossoming ecosystems that thrived on the seafloor. Consisting of 29 low-lying coral atolls, or a ring-shaped island surrounding smaller bodies of water, the Marshall Islands is home to 1,156 different islands and islets. While the islands may appear to be uninhabited to the untrained eye, that's simply not the case. Migrants from Southeast Asia, known as Micronesians, came to this paradise home as early as 2000 BCE, and their descendants today maintain a rich and beautiful culture. Surprisingly, there's no account of the residents of these islands coming into contact with Europeans until Captain Samuel Wallis happened upon them in 1529. Even then, their namesake captain, John Marshall of the British Navy, did not venture through the atolls until 1788, and the majority of the mapping in this area was done by Russian explorers between 1808 and 1823. Over the centuries, native Marshallese chieftains brokered deals with various captains and companies across the world. Germany even held the islands for a brief time in the 1800s after paying the Spaniards a whopping $45 million. Germany let the Marshall Islands run themselves, with the exception of a few Protestant ministers starting a campaign to convert the Marshallese people throughout the 1850s. Unfortunately, peace between the quiet atolls and the rest of the world would not last. Today, the Marshall Islands may be known as a sovereign nation with 24 separate municipalities, but this was not always the case. After World War I, with a mandate from the League of Nations, the Imperial Japanese military seized the islands in 1914. Like many imperialist regimes before her, Japan followed the doctrine of conformism, forcing the Marshallese natives to practice Japanese customs and culture. Imperial Japan relocated 1,000 settlers to the Marshall Islands to build numerous airstrips and military bases focused on Kwajalein Atoll. However, Japan lost its newfound concubine in 1941 when they decided to provoke the United States into World War II with their attack on Pearl Harbor. After a bloody invasion that pushed the Axis powers out, the Marshall Islands was occupied by the United States for the rest of World War II. After the war ended, the United States was granted official jurisdiction over the Marshall Islands as a trust territory in 1947 by the United Nations. While the United States did seem to treat the people of the Marshall Islands better than their predecessors, the real reason the US wanted these atolls was not for humanitarian ideals, but for use in atmospheric nuclear arms development. Men and their toys. Due to their secluded location, low population at the time, and moderately stable weather patterns, the Marshall Islands were the perfect place to assess the next generation of atomic weaponry. According to the US Embassy in the Marshall Islands, over the course of 12 years between 1946 and 1958, a total of 67 nuclear tests were conducted over the island. Specifically, the Eniwetok and Bikini atolls were dedicated for official testing, their populations being relocated and uprooted for the cause. The beautiful Marshall Islands and her people were once again pawns for larger players in the game. As military generals know, there is no second place when it comes to war. If you're not the strongest force on the field, you lose. There's no participation trophy here. Not wanting to be surpassed by her peers, the US felt compelled to develop a weapon even greater than the ones displayed in Japan before anybody else had the chance to. The weapon in mind was the hydrogen bomb. President Truman stated in his decision to allow further development on thermonuclear arms testing in 1950, "It is part of my responsibility as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces to see to it that our country is able to defend itself against any possible aggressor. Accordingly, I have directed the Atomic Energy Commission to continue its work on all forms of atomic weapons, including the so-called hydrogen or superbomb. It is being and will be carried forward on a basis consistent with the overall objectives of our program for peace and security." While some may have objected, such as the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, David Lilienthal, the overall sentiment of officials was to develop a weapon that guaranteed US military superiority and security. Dubbed the Super by its creators, the technology in question for the hydrogen bomb had to do with thermonuclear development. The earlier weapons used at the end of World War II were Fat Man, an implosion-based plutonium bomb, and Little Boy, a gun-type uranium bomb. Weighing in at 9,700 pounds and 10,800 pounds respectively, this kind of atomic weaponry was the first of its kind to ever see real warfare. Fat Man and Little Boy used a nuclear fission reaction in their explosions, an immensely powerful force that is expensive to create and inefficient to use. The innovative technology that scientists were attempting to produce is what's known as a controlled fusion reaction. Essentially, it involves recreating the reactions that resemble what happens inside of the sun, where deuterons, the nuclei of the naturally occurring heavy form of hydrogen, would react explosively together under the enormous temperatures created during an atomic explosion and would produce helium and huge amounts of energy. This type of controlled reaction was seen as nearly impossible until the development of the fission bomb in the Manhattan Project that created Fat Man and Little Boy. Out of 67 nuclear arms tests, 23 were conducted directly on the Bikini Atoll, and 44 others were conducted on or around Eniwetok Atoll. Among them were the series known as Operation Greenhouse, Operation Ivy, and Operation Castle. In the beginning, between 1946 and 1949, in order to understand and develop a fusion thermonuclear bomb, researchers had to first focus on enhancing their understanding of fission reactions. To do this, scientists at the Los Alamos Laboratory focused on two key areas. The first being how to ignite a relatively small mass of fuel with the energy that is produced by a large fission explosion, or the boosting principle. However, the arguably more complicated question came from their other line of research: how to ignite a large amount of fuel with a relatively small amount of energy produced in a fission reaction. A report published in the spring of 1946 titled "The Conference on the Super" judged that the theoretical design was in fact possible to create. However, progress on the hydrogen bomb was stagnant due to the lack of space and resources available in a laboratory setting. The first series of nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands began with Operation Greenhouse in 1951 on the Eniwetok Atoll. These tests were conducted to compare unique design principles that would later go on to be crucial in understanding thermonuclear weapons. Particularly, Operation Ivy instigated size and weight ratios as well as fuel levels that could increase the weapon's impact. The most crucial of tests conducted throughout Operation Greenhouse, nicknamed George, evaluated a device with a large fission mass that was able to ignite a small amount of thermonuclear fuel. The device operated on a principle from 1946 called the radiation implosion principle. After proving to be successful, George went down in scientific history as the largest fission explosion to date that was able to ignite its first ever thermonuclear flame. George's success was a key element in furthering research for the super thermonuclear bomb. After the success that came from Operation Greenhouse and George, the United States continued their research with Operation Ivy in 1952. In this series, scientists were solely focusing on thermonuclear reactions, unlike Operation Greenhouse. Also conducted on Anahuac, the first test in Operation Ivy began on the island of Elugalab. The test, named Mike Shot, rolled in with a whopping 10 megaton energy equivalent of TNT and was over 1,000 times as large as the bombs used on Imperial Japan in 1945. Mike Shot proved successful. However, the thermonuclear fuel used in this test was liquid deuterium, a substance that would need to be kept at a refrigerated temperature until the time of the explosion in order for safe transportation. This meant that the use of a weapon like the one designed for Mike Shot was extremely impractical and could not be used in actual warfare. The test King Shot that followed next in Operation Ivy was instead another fission bomb. King Shot yielded approximately the equivalent of 500 kilotons of TNT, worlds away from its predecessor Little Boy that only yielded 13 kilotons. The experiment proved to be revolutionary, as it meant that the scientists did not necessarily need to build thermonuclear technology in order to build a bomb massive enough to stop the Soviets. Taking place in the spring of 1954, the third and potentially most harmful series of testing conducted on the atolls of the Marshall Islands was known as Operation Castle. Consisting of 6 variations of thermonuclear bombs, Operation Castle was the second series of thermonuclear tests to be conducted. Out of the 6, the Castle Bravo test, conducted with a nuclear device nicknamed Shrimp, was the most impactful and unexpected. In the early morning of March 4, 1952, the United States exploded Shrimp over the Bikini Atoll. The results of this test were absolutely catastrophic. Castle Bravo's Shrimp weighed in at 23,500 pounds, much larger than the former weapons used or assessed prior. Relying on lithium deuteride for fuel, Shrimp was calculated to produce the yield equivalent to 6 to 8 megatons of TNT. Unfortunately for Bikini Atoll, this was a severe miscalculation. Known today as one of the world's worst nuclear fallout disasters, Operation Castle Bravo produced a massive 15 megaton equivalent of TNT, which was twice as strong as they had anticipated and 1,000 times more powerful than Little Boy. However, the initial blast and its mushroom clouds that stretched 4 miles wide and climbed to a height of 130,000 feet were not the only issues in the situation. While it's true that the United States had relocated all of the citizens who were living on the Bikini and Anahuac atolls, the impact of Castle Bravo rained down radioactive debris into the skies across 7,000 miles of the surrounding area. Aside from the aerial impact, Castle Bravo left a 250-foot deep crater in the ocean floor that stretches across 6,500 feet. Hundreds of servicemen stationed on Ragnarok Atoll to observe the explosion firsthand had an extreme amount of radioactive exposure. But to make matters worse, this explosion not only decimated any life on Bikini Atoll, but also contaminated inhabitants on nearby atolls, specifically Rongelap, Uttarik, and Alinganay. This incident truly soured the global opinion on the development of nuclear weaponry. Despite the unfavorable weather conditions prior to the test on the morning of March 4, 1952, the commander responsible for the test, Major General Percy Clarkson, and the scientific director of Operation Castle, Dr. Alvin C. Graves, decided to move forward with the rest of the series as planned. Unfortunately, this was a huge mistake. The Rongelap Atoll was arguably the most impacted by this decision, as nuclear fallout rained down on this island only 5 hours after the explosion. Since the dangers of this fine white powder were not known to the residents, children were recorded to be playing in the fallout like it was snow. They were catching flakes on their tongues as they floated down from the clouds. The US did not relocate the residents of Rongelap Atoll for another 2 days. In the aftermath, it was seen that the effects of Castle Bravo would be felt with traces of radioactive fallout found across Japan, Australia, India, and as far away as Europe and the United States. 2 weeks after the explosion, the United States began conducting research on the effects of the radiation on the contaminated individuals, and this effort became known as Project 4.1. However, many medical professionals and researchers condemned the project for the lack of consent from the Marshallese people. In a paper published in 2014, historian April Brown wrote, "The Marshallese were told they were being treated for their various illnesses, but rarely was a translator present to explain what tests were being conducted or for what purpose. Marshallese were given pills to take with no accompanying explanation as to why they were supposed to take them." While the US did treat the sick and injured victims of the Castle Bravo experiments, the intentions may not have been as pure as they could have been. The impact of Castle Bravo may have stayed a secret to the general public on the US mainland were it not for a Japanese civilian fishing vessel that had been caught inside of the contamination zone after the explosion. Lucky Dragon No. 5 was sailing 145 kilometers downwind from the initial impact zone, but all 23 fishermen aboard the ship suffered from severe radiation poisoning. One of them even succumbed to it a few months later. However, due to their exposure, the crew brought contaminated fish home to the Japanese market, and this event shook the international stage, causing a further strain on US-Japanese relations. The local fishing economies in Japan were stagnated, as officials had no way of knowing where the contaminated fish had been. A US diplomat, Richard A. Erickson Jr., remembers, "You could smell the fish markets in Japan for miles weeks afterwards because they didn't know where the fish had gone and they lost track of distribution." Even Tokyo's enormous fish market sold very few fish for weeks. It was a serious economic disruption, in addition to being a psychological body blow to Japan. Prior to Castle Bravo, the United States and the Soviet Union had been conducting research in an attempt to surpass one another during the Cold War. Unsurprisingly, the incident on March 4, 1952 sparked a call for a standstill agreement between the two countries to stop their testing. Following the test, there was an increased public push against the further development of any nuclear weapon, but the limited test ban treaty between the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union would not go into effect until 1963, more than a decade after the incident. Humanity will never cease to surprise itself in all the ways that they found to hurt each other. Mutually assured destruction, or the guarantee that no one will win that fight, is one way to prevent world-ending scenarios. However, the larger players in the game always seem to forget that their actions in developing such a level of destruction will have unimaginable consequences on the world in the meantime. The overarching message the world should have gained from this tragedy is that one man's collateral damage is another man's father. May we never forget that.